Hello. In one of my recent patches, I was experimenting with including different delay modules on different voices. And while I was doing that, I thought this might also be a good subject for a tutorial. So in this video, we'll create a couple of simple voices and use different delay effects to enhance each of them, with the end result sounding something like this. Since there will be a lot of ground to cover, and to keep the tutorial from running too long, I won't dive into full detail on every module, but instead focus on explaining only those parts that are needed for this patch. As you can see, a couple of modules have already been added to the patch. This is the base template that I use as a starting point for all of my patches. There is a Mixmaster Junior mixer and its Aux Expander Junior from MindMeld, and a Valley Reverb from Plateau that's set up as a send effect. The Aux A output goes into the Plateau input, and the reverb output goes back into the mixer. As a send effect, the dry incoming signal is completely muted, and the wet reverb effect is set to 100%. There is a bit of modulation depth applied, and the lows and the highs on both the input filter and the reverb filter are closed down a little. And then the output of the mixer is sent into the audio output. We will also need a clock in this patch, so let's add the clock module from Impromptu and set that to 60 beats per minute. We'll be using a simple chord sequence in this patch, which will be stored in the AddrSeq module from Bogaudio. And to easily set up this sequence, we'll add a quantizer from VCV after it. Connect the sequencer output to the quantizer, and the first chord of the sequence will be a C, which is already correct on 0 volts. So let's move to the second chord, which will increase until an F shows up on the quantizer. For the third step, we'll move to a G chord, and the fourth is again a C, so we can leave that as is. Move the selection back to the first step, and change the number of steps until that's on 4. We'll slow down the first clocked output to -4, and connect that with the sequencer clock input. So now our chord sequence is running. Underneath all of the voices, I also want to have a simple bass voice running. We'll play that using the Saich module from Instruo. Reduce the level on the mixer to -15 dB, and connect the output of the Saich with the mixer. We want it to be a bass voice, so let's add in an Oct module from VCV to lower it. Connect the Oct output to the volt per octave input, and over here we can send that voice 2 octaves down. Connect the quantized chord sequence to the Oct input, and the Saich is now playing that sequence. But it sounds very harsh, so let's add in an I-o47 filter to soften that up. Connect the Saich output to the I-o47 input, and the low pass output back into the mixer. Open up the filter a bit more, to about 0.57. That sounds good. Add a little reverb on the channel, set it to -20 dB. And now we have the framework ready, on top of which we can construct some voices to play with delays. The first voice we'll create will be a very simple one. As the sequencer moves to the next step, this voice will pick one of the notes from the active chord and play it. So there will be one note triggered every 4 beats. To get the notes from the current chord, we'll use a dIKT module from Bidoo. Connect its input to the quantized chord sequence, and now based on this input, it will provide the root, third, fifth, and 7th notes of the chord. And it constructs that chord based on the assigned scale and scale type. C Ionian is a C major scale, so that already matches what we need for this patch. To pick one of the chord notes at random, I'll add a sequential switch 8-to-1 from ML modules. Connect the first 4 inputs of the switch to the chord notes on dIKT, and set it to have 4 steps in the sequence. And now we can trigger it to choose a note at random by connecting the random trigger input to the clock that also triggers the chord changes. Now each time a clock comes in, it will switch to one of the inputs at random and send that to its output. To play these notes, we'll use a macro Oscillator 2 from Audible instruments. Connect the switch to the volt per octave input, We're also going to use the internal VCA from this module, so connect the trigger input to the same clock signal and connect the output with the mixer. To model the sound, I'm going to set it to the second pitched model. So click this button once to move the selection down to the waveshaping oscillator. And let's close down the harmonics to around 33%. Move both the timbre and the morph to the 9 o'clock position. And I think that sounds quite nice, but a bit short. If we go to the right click menu and go to the Edit LPG Response Decay, then this knob over here that is turned blue will control the decay time of the internal VCA. Move that to around 75% and the notes get a longer tail. Disable the editing of the LPG response decay again and add some reverb on this voice to -12 dB. And now we have our very simple first voice. So let's add in the delay. We'll use the delay module from SurgeXT for this voice. Send the output into the delay and the stereo delay back into the mixer. And now you can hear that delayed sound kicking in. But if you look at the trigger over here, you'll notice that it is not playing as the note is triggered. This is because we're currently only hearing the delay signal. We'll reduce the mix to 75%, so you also hear the original note being played before the delays. The delay is currently set to 1 second, which matches with the 60 BPM of the clock, so the notes and the delays are in sync. We can make this more interesting by bringing the right delay out of sync, for example to 0.75 seconds. And now you hear a nice offbeat happening on the right side. We can also do this on the left side. Let's use a much longer delay here of 2.75 seconds, which is also out of sync with the 60 BPM. And the left and right delays are also not in sync with each other, which gives us a much more complex rhythm pattern. Another interesting feature of this module is a cross feedback. This causes the left delay to feed back into the right and the other way around. Let's set that to 33%. And now the short delay starts to cross over into the longer one, and afterwards the longer goes back into the shorter one. But it's starting to get a bit crowded now, so let's set the feedback to 33% so that there are fewer repeats in the delay. That sounds more balanced. Now something that sounds nice when using these kinds of delays is to have a combination of higher and lower notes, but the notes over here are all within the same octave, since that's how they come out of dIKT. So let's add in some octave randomization. Add in an oct module from VCV, send the notes through it, and now we can change their octave over here up or down. To automate that, we'll use a Bogaudio sample and hold module. Trigger that when a new note starts. Set its internal noise generator between 0 and 1 volts. And send the output to the octave shift CV input. And now the octave will update each time a new note is played. 0 to 1 volts either leaving them as is or sending them up 1 octave, as you can see when that yellow LED lights up. And now you can hear how a very simple chain of modules, playing a note once every 4 beats, can be given a lot more depth by adding in a delay. And you can play with the complexity of the rhythm by playing with the ratio of the delays between them and compare to the main clock ratio. You can make the delays overlap by having them run in sync, or have a more complex pattern by having them run out of sync like we did here. The second voice in this patch will be playing random notes. Let's first close the gap between the modules over here. And then to generate the random notes, we'll use another sample and hold module with the range set to plus and minus 1 volt, so that will be 2 octaves. We'll also have to quantize these notes. Connect the sample and hold to the quantizer, click and drag to disable all notes, and set it to a C major pentatonic. So that's a C, D, E, G, and an A. We'll use a second clock output to trigger the sample and hold. And the notes will be played using an FM-OP module. I'm not going to use the internal VCA and envelope generator, but instead add an AD module from Bogaudio, which will trigger envelopes to trigger a VCA module from VCV. Send the quantized nodes into the volt per octave input of the FM-OP, the output of the FM-OP into the VCA input, connect the AD envelope output to the CV input of the VCA, and send the VCA output into the mixer. Lower the level on the mixer to -11 dB. And now we can trigger the volume envelope using the same clock output. Let's mute the first voice for now. Move the FM-OP 1 octave higher by doubling the frequency ratio. Add a bit of punch by opening the feedback to 17.5. We'll use a very short attack for the volume of 0.01. And also reduce the decay to half a second. Give it some reverb at -12 dB. And for this voice, the delay will be provided by the tap dancer by flag. Close down as BPM all the way to 60. Over here you control the modulation that will be performed by the module. I'm going to close down the rate all the way to the minimum. And reduce the modulation depth to 12.5. Now we take the VCA output and send it into the delay. And connect the left and right outputs to the mixer. Now what this module does is take the input signal, and based on the tempo set over here, it will repeat that based on these so-called taps over here. The first triggers after 1.25 beats on the left, the second after 1.5 beats on the right, the third after 1.75 beats, and the fourth after 2 beats. And you can control how loud these repeats are. You can change all these values to your liking, but I found that the default values are already nice sounding. There is also a feedback loop in this delay, which by default is triggered after 2.5 beats. Now what I have found with this delay is that if you don't feed it a constant stream of notes on its input like we're doing here, but instead introduce some gaps, it really brings out the sound of the delay much better. So to introduce some gaps, let's add in a Bernoulli gate. Let the clock trigger first go into the Bernoulli gate, and then use one of the outputs for the envelope trigger. Also disconnect the sample and hold from the clock, and trigger it using the same gate output. And now we have some randomized gaps in our voice, during which the delay can really shine. Over here, the delay has a ducking control. As a signal is detected on the input, this will cause the volume of the delay itself to be reduced. Let's reduce that down to 0.25 so that the delay isn't muted as much. And there is also a duck control on the feedback. We'll close that down even further to 0.15. And then also increase the volume of that feedback to 0.75. So you really hear those repeats coming in. And I think that's a very beautiful sounding delay. But for this voice, I actually want to use it to get a different effect. One that works well when we don't play these shorter notes, but instead play longer notes. Let's first reduce the clock ratio to -2. But since that makes this gate signal become longer, it starts to retrigger our volume envelope. So we'll disable the retrigger on the module, so that the new trigger doesn't do anything as long as there's an envelope still active. Now we increase the attack to 2.5 seconds and the decay to 5 seconds to get those longer notes. But you can hear that as the envelope is still in progress, new triggers coming in are changing the note that is playing, because I trigger the sample and hold. Now I have another tutorial dedicated to the Bernoulli gate that you can check out, that explains how we can use this probability CV input to avoid this, by using a Bogaudio DGate module. As this A output triggers a new note, we let it also trigger a gate. That we then set to a length of 8 seconds here, which is slightly longer than the attack and decay of the envelope. And we use that gate output on the probability CV input, so that it will use a probability all the way towards the right, and thus the B output, as an envelope is still active. If this all went a bit fast, I invite you to check out that Bernoulli gate tutorial after this, which explains the process in more detail. And you can hear now how the delay effect of the tap dancer is turning the tail end of those long notes into a beautiful fade out. As the VCA closes down, the delay starts taking over. And we can make it sound even better. If we increase the mix to 0.925 so that it's almost only the delayed output, then as the VCA opens up, that fade-in will also be spread out by the delay. Let's enrich that sound a bit more. Add in a second FM-OP module. Ctrl Shift and drag to give it the same volt per octave input. We'll let this play an octave higher, so double the frequency ratio. And let the first FM-OP play an additional octave higher, so double that again to 4. We'll use a second FM-OP as FM input on the first one. Open up the FM depth to 7.5. And also give the second FM-OP that 17.5% feedback. And now you hear the sound of that second FM-OP feeding into the now higher sound of the first one, giving a richer input signal for the tap dancer to then spread out, which gets a lot of movement due to the left-right effect of the different delay taps and the feedback loop. Let's enable the first voice again now. We'll reduce how often the second voice is triggered by changing the probability on the Bernoulli gate so that it sends more triggers to the B output versus the A output that triggers the new notes. And that concludes the second voice, in which the tap dancer showed two possible uses for a delay, either as a delay for note sequences or as a more special effect to enhance the sound that you might not immediately recognize as a delay. For the third voice, we're going to go back to chord notes. So we'll use the dIKT output again. And this time we'll play arpeggiated chord notes. So let's add in a 4-to-1 switch from VCV. Connect the root, third and fifth to the switch. Turn the switch into 3 steps, because that's how many notes there are, and trigger it using the third clock output. We'll let that clock output run at double speed, so that this voice plays a bit faster, and now we have to play the notes coming out of the output. Let's add in an Instruo I-o47 module for this. Connect the switch to the volt per octave input, and here we'll also need an envelope and VCA. The Instruo I-o47 module will be our envelope generator, and the Vinca will be the VCA. Ctrl Shift and drag to use the same clock trigger on the I-o47 input. And this unipolar positive output will contain a generated envelope. Connect that with the Vinca CV input. And we'll use the wavefold output of the I-o47. Reduce the level on the mixer to -12 dB. And connect the Vinca output to the mixer. Let's mute the other voices while we work on this one. Open up the wavefolding on the I-o47 a little bit to 0.033. Close the envelope attack duration almost all the way down. Open up the release to let the notes sound out a bit more. That 0.656 sounds good. Increase the VCA amplitude to 1 so that it doesn't reduce the volume. And give the voice some reverb at -14 dB. Now all these notes are again close to each other. And just like with the first voice, it would be nice to have some higher notes in there. For this voice we're going to do that by introducing some randomization, which will be done by the Fate module from Geodesics. This module expects voltages on its input and can change these on its output. The input here will be our arpeggiated chords, so we send those through the module. And now we have to tell Fate when it's allowed to change values. And we do that by giving it a trigger each time we want it to have the possibility of happening. So let's use our clock signal for that again. And how often we want the values to be changed is set on this free will knob. Let's set that to 0.15, so that 15% of the triggers cause a change to be applied on the incoming signal. The last thing we need to do is indicate how we want the signal to be changed when that happens. If you turn the choices tab knob to the right, it will either add or remove voltages from both left and right signals, each time the free will activates on a received trigger. If you turn the knob to the left, then the left side will get voltages added, and the right side will have them removed. And the amount that you turn defines how big the changes can be. Let's set that to around -0.25, so that it will cause higher notes to be included every now and again. But the Fate module adds random amounts of voltage, so these changes will no longer be in tune. Let's fix that using a quantizer. Disable all the black keys of the keyboard, so that it's set to a regular C major scale, and send the signal to the quantizer. So now we have arpeggiated chords with the occasional randomness added. The delay we're using in this voice is the Chronoblob 2 by All Right devices. Send the voice into the left input, sync the delay with our main clock, and send the outputs back into the mixer. Set this switch to crossfading so that changes we do sound less abrupt, and now we can hear that delay. But it is currently set to 1, so it matches the main clock. It is just overlapping the delays with the note triggers. We can adjust this delay time, for example speed it up to 1.5 on the left, and you do get more of a rhythmic pattern. But as you move to the slower delays on the right, you again go back in sync with the main clock. So everything just overlaps because of the way this voice works. There is however a way to make it sound more interesting. Set the delay time back to 1, and in the right click menu you can select the factor that should be applied to the incoming sync. Let's set that to the divided by 1.5. So the 60 BPM of the clock will now become 40 BPM in the delay. And if we now move the delay time to the 1.5 on the right, the delay slows down again and becomes much more interesting. You get much more rhythm in there. Now let's look at these delay modes over here. If we move that away from the default dual mode, where everything just repeats straight on, instead set it to ping pong mode by clicking the button once. The left input will first be repeated on the right, and then left and back right. And the right first on the left, right, and so on. But nothing seemed to change when we click the button. This is because if there is nothing connected to the right input, it will instead also normalize the left input on the right input. If we however connect something to the right input and nothing to the left, then you do hear that left-right ping pong effect coming in. Which can be a very nice effect depending on your input signal. But for this patch I was thinking of using one of the other settings of the Chronoblob, because you still have these two remaining blue modes. In these modes the module is no longer a stereo delay. Let's hook up the Vinca with the left input again and disconnect the right output from the mixer, because if we switch the module into the single with send return mode, then the blue label above this output indicates that the module will now send any delay signal it generates to this output, from where you can send it into another module to process a signal, and then send the processed sound back into this return input, from where it will be combined with the rest to go towards the main output. So let's add in a module to process that delay signal. We'll use the Waveshaper from SurgeXT, connect the send output with its left input, and connect the left output back with the return input. So now you can hear how the Waveshaper is changing the sound of that delay signal. Let's change the dry-wet ratio a little bit more towards the delays with 0.6, so that the delay sound becomes a bit more present. Now this is a single send return delay setting. There is also a fourth option, which is a cascade with send return. In this mode there is an additional internal feedback loop within the delay module, which adds additional layers to the sound before it is sent to the output. Let's change the sound of the Waveshaper a bit. Set it to the harmonic additive 1+2 mode, which has a bit less volume, so we'll add 5 dB of drive to it. And now we can subtly change it with this bias knob. You see how the pattern above changes as I turn it. So let's automate this change. Add in an LLFO module from Bogaudio. Set it to a triangle waveform. Connect that with the first mod input of the Waveshaper. Slow down the LFO to 0.05 Hz. And now if we click this button over here, we can specify that this LFO signal should modulate the bias knob by clicking and dragging it, for example to 30%. Disable the edit mode by clicking the button again, and now you can see how that blue line above the knob modulates the bias and changes this shape over time. And since the LFO moves between plus and minus 5 volts, that means that it's actually moving between minus 15 and 15%. Let's also enable high cut on the module by clicking over here and closing that down to around 5100 Hz. Which will cut out some higher frequencies of the Waveshaper, making it a bit less harsh. And with that, our third voice is also done. Add in the first two voices again, and our mix is already starting to sound a lot richer now. For the final voice, I want to start with a randomized evolving note sequence. The sequence will be constructed using two modules from the Geodesics collection, Branes and Pulsars. Branes is a sample and hold module with a high brain and a low brain. We'll be using the bottom low one. Trigger it using the divided by 2 clock, and when it receives a trigger on its input, it will sample the current value on all of its inputs and hold those values on the corresponding outputs. And if nothing is connected to the inputs, it will instead sample internal pink, red, blue and white noise generators and use those values. The reason for using the bottom brain is that if you click this button over here so that the LED lights up, you can see over here that it says -1 to 1, so the values generated by these outputs will be within that range. And over here it says 0 to 1, so that's the range that these outputs will generate, which is a nice range to use for random nodes. Let's hook up all of the outputs to the inputs on the Pulsars module. And in its default configuration, if nothing is connected to one of the Pulsar inputs, such as this top one now, the module will simply skip that step, pretend it's not there, so we end up with a 7-step sequence. But I said I wanted an evolving sequence, and right now, the values of all of these Branes outputs change each time a trigger is received. So it's not really evolving, it's just jumping. But there's a way to change this. In the right-click menu, if we select the option to put the low brain into young mode, then instead of changing all the values each time a trigger is received, the module will choose one of the outputs at random and generate a new value for that one, while the other outputs remain the same. So on the Pulsar sequence, the sequence will slowly evolve over time. Now we need to tell Pulsars to move through the sequence, which is done through its rotation input. Connect that to the clock, and nothing changes immediately. That's because it's currently set to bipolar mode, which expects a ramped input to cause movement. Click it once to unipolar mode, and now a clock signal will cause it to move each time a value changes, which you can see as the blue dot moves, both when the value goes from 0 to 10 and from 10 back to 0. Now we can use this output for playing that note sequence. First we need to quantize again since these are random values. Connect Pulsars to the quantizer, click and drag to remove all notes, and again select the C major pentatonic scale with a C, D, E, G and A. Since we're already using Geodesics modules, I'm going to use a DarkEnergy module from the same collection to play these notes. Connect the quantized sequence to its input, reduce the volume on the mixer to -10 dB, and connect the DarkEnergy output with the mixer. Mute the other voices for now, and click this button to activate the internal VCA of the module, which will cause the volume to be triggered each time a note change is detected on the input. We can set the length of the notes over here, set that to 200 milliseconds. I'm going to let the module play 1 octave higher, and send the left oscillator an additional octave up. We'll leave the right one where it is. Add 0.05 cross modulation on the right oscillator. Do some self modulation on the left oscillator with 0.125. And also a little on the right oscillator with 0.03. Also give this voice -12 dB reverb. And now the voice is ready to add a delay. For this voice, I'll use the Prince of Perception from Flag. This delay records the incoming signal, which you will see over here, and then you set the delay time that it has to use. Let's send the DarkEnergy into it, send the delay back into the mixer. I'm going to set the delay time to 1.75 seconds. And this is again out of sync with the main clock, so it will again generate a nice counter rhythm. Let's tell the module to generate a bit more repeats at 0.6 feedback. And also increase the volume of those repeats a bit more at 0.33. Which fills out the sound a bit more. Now this module has a couple of other tricks up its sleeve. One of them is this reverse button. When you enable that, instead of playing the recorded buffer normally, the module will play it back in reverse, which you can hear in the way that the volume of the notes in the delay is now reversed. And there's also a CV input for this, which will enable reverse mode as long as the input is high. Let's disable reverse again and look at the second trick, which is a freeze mode. Enable this, and now the content of the buffer is frozen, no longer recording the incoming signal. And using this scan button, you can scrub through that frozen buffer, which you can hear as I move it up and down. There's also a CV input for this, so let's modulate this input automatically. Add an LLFO module from Bogaudio, set it to 0.25 Hz, change it to a triangle wave, and connect this output to the scan CV input. Open up the attenuator to 0.75, and now you can hear that anytime the LFO is in the positive range, it will scan through that frozen buffer, while negative values will do nothing. Now I want to randomize the triggering of these two features. Send a 10 volt signal to either of these inputs at random times. For this, let's add in another Bernoulli gate. I'm going to change the mode of the top part by clicking this button over here, so that instead of sending any input triggers to either the A or B output, the module will always have either the A or the B output set to 10 volts, and a trigger on the input has a chance to change which of them is high. Use a divided by 4 clock to trigger this. So now I want to set this B output to either the freeze or the reverse inputs. So let's connect the B output to the lower input of the Bernoulli gate, which is still in the default mode, so it will send that input signal to either its A or B output, which we can then connect to the Prince of Perception. If this Bernoulli gate stuff went a bit fast, I would again invite you to watch that tutorial on the Bernoulli gate, which explains these techniques in much more detail. Now one issue that I have with the setup right now is that freeze and scan is nice, but it shouldn't last that long. When the A output is sending out 10 volts, I want the probability to become higher that the next trigger will turn it off again. It doesn't have to be sure to turn off, but more likely, which we can do with this probability input. Add in an offset module. Connect that with the bottom A output. Scale that value down by half, so when the freeze is active, this output will become 5 volts. I'm going to move the top output to the A1, reduce the overall probability to 25%, and connect that offset output to the probability CV input. So now anytime a gate from the top gate causes the bottom section to set the A output to 10 volts, that A output causes the 5 volts to be added to the probability of the top section. So this actually becomes 75%, and thus more likely that it will change the next time an input trigger is received, as if you're moving this button by hand each time that bottom A output is high. I do think this has ended up being a bit crowded right now. To fix that, I want to let the Pulsars module move less frequently. So let's take its clock input and send that through the unused section of the first Bernoulli gate, so it will only send half of the clock triggers to the Pulsars module, and also add some randomization to that movement, so now there is a bit more space in that voice. We can bring in the other voices again now, And with that, we have 4 different voices that all use different delays in their own way. While the voices themselves are not that complex, the delays add a lot of sound and texture to them, enriching the whole mix. And while I only use 4 delay modules in this tutorial, there are a lot more of them available in the VCV Rack library. So I now invite you to use the techniques shown here and experiment with them. Give them your own twist. Which is also what I did myself once I had constructed a patch for this tutorial. I made a couple of smaller changes to these voices, like replacing the Prince of Perception with his stereo sibling Prism of Perception, using a different chord sequence, and added some additional voices, and tweaked the overall mix balance, which resulted in my recently released FP-TTTP patch. So if you want to hear one direction that this patch can go in, feel free to check out that track. And as always, thank you for watching and happy patching.